On the morning the bulldozers were supposed to arrive, the entire tree line at the edge of Halloway Ridge had turned into a wall of thorns 12 feet thick, and nobody in the county could explain how it grew there overnight. That's not a folk tale. That's exactly what happened outside a small farming town in southern Ohio in the autumn of 1987, and by the time the story was over, a 12-year-old boy named Corwin Attwater had done something that grown men with law degrees and bulldozer keys never saw coming. Before we get into it, if you love true-to-life farm stories with a little mystery, a little grit, and a lesson worth passing down to your own kids or grandkids, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is full of stories just like this one, and you won't want to miss what's coming next week. All right, let's get into it. Corwin Attwater lived with his grandfather, a lean, quiet man named Ezekiel Attwater, on 60 acres that bordered a stretch of old-growth woodland the town simply called the Ridge. The Attwater farm had been in the family since 1911, and the forest beside it had never belonged to anyone, not really. It had been common land, unclaimed and untouched, for longer than anyone in Miller's Fork could remember. Deer moved through it in the fall. Kids fished the creek that cut through its center. Old Ezekiel had taught Corwin to identify birdsong in that forest before the boy could properly tie his own boots. Then, in the spring of that year, a development company rolled into town. The company was called Kestrel Vance Holdings, run by a sharp-suited man named Barnaby Kessling, who had a habit of smiling with his mouth but never with his eyes. Kessling had purchased 3 adjoining parcels from families who'd fallen on hard times, and he had his surveyor's sights set on the ridge next. His plan: clear-cut the forest, drain the wetland behind it, and build a strip of discount retail stores and a parking lot big enough for 800 cars. The problem was, nobody could prove who owned the ridge. County records were a mess, a common problem in small rural counties where land had passed through handshake deals and unfiled wills for a century. Kessling's lawyers argued that unclaimed land defaulted to whoever filed first, and Kessling filed fast. Old Ezekiel Attwater tried to fight it the traditional way. He went to town meetings. He wrote letters to the county clerk. He even drove 2 hours to the state capitol to speak with a land use attorney, a trip that cost him money he didn't really have. Every door he knocked on gave him the same answer. Without a deed, without a documented claim, the ridge was fair game. Corwin watched his grandfather grow tired in a way he'd never seen before. Not tired from farm work. Ezekiel had done that his whole life and never once complained. This was a different kind of tired. The tired of a man watching something he loved slip through his fingers with no way to hold on. One night in late August, Corwin found his grandfather sitting on the porch with an old cigar box open on his lap. Inside were seeds, small, hard, wrinkled things, dark as coffee beans, along with a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings and a hand-drawn map. "What are those?" Corwin asked. "Osage orange seeds," Ezekiel said. "Boy's dark, some folks call it. French settlers named it, that means bough wood. Native tribes prized the wood for making bows because it's strong and springy, but before barbed wire ever existed, farmers all across the Midwest used this tree for something else entirely." "What's that?" "Fencing," Ezekiel said. "Living fencing. You plant these trees close together in a row, and within a few years they grow into a hedge so dense and so thorn that no cow, no horse, not even a determined man can push through it. They called it horse-high, bull-strong, and hog-tight. Whole farms were fenced this way for decades before wire got cheap. My own grandfather planted a hedge of it along our property line back in 1911, and some of those old trees are still standing out past the north pasture, gnarled and half forgotten." Corwin turned one of the seeds over in his fingers. It didn't look like much, nothing like the 12-foot wall of green, thorned muscle his grandfather was describing. "Why do you keep these?" the boy asked. Ezekiel didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the dark shape of the ridge against the night sky, the forest that had shaded his own boyhood summers, the same way it had shaded his father's. "Because some things you protect with paper," he finally said, "and when paper fails you, you protect them with roots." That was the moment the story really begins. Here's the educational part, and it matters, because it's the whole reason what happened next actually worked. Osage orange trees, scientifically called Maclura pomifera, aren't just thorny nuisances. Pioneers across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Kansas planted them deliberately in the 1850s through the 1880s as living fences before barbed wire became widely available and affordable. A properly grown Osage orange hedge, planted in a tight row and pruned low to encourage dense lateral branching, becomes almost impossible to pass through. The wood is famously rot-resistant fence posts made from it have been known to outlast the fences they were holding up. And crucially, under many old township and county ordinances from that era, a maintained hedge row of this kind was recognized in law as a legitimate boundary marker and fence line, every bit as legally binding as a surveyed deed. Because for decades, that's exactly what rural landowners used in place of one. Ezekiel remembered this. Kessling's lawyers, city men who'd never spent a season on a farm, did not. Over the following 6 weeks, working mostly at dawn before school and after supper until the light gave out, Corwin and his grandfather planted Osage orange seedlings along the exact boundary line marked on Ezekiel's grandfather's original 1911 survey, a survey Ezekiel had kept folded inside a Bible for 76 years, one that had never been formally refiled with the county because, back then, nobody thought they'd ever need to. But young trees take years to become a wall. They didn't have years. The bulldozers were coming in October. This is where the story turns from stubborn to something closer to brilliant. Corwin remembered something else his grandfather had mentioned almost as an aside, that the old original hedge, planted by his great-great-grandfather in 1911 along the north pasture, was still alive. Neglected, wild, tangled with decades of undergrowth, but alive. 12-foot Osage orange trees don't disappear. They just get forgotten. So Corwin did something almost nobody in town knew was possible. Over 3 days, with his grandfather's guidance and the help of 2 farmhands from a neighboring property, he cleared the overgrowth choking the old 1911 hedge line, cutting back decades of wild bramble, invasive vine, and fallen limbs that had hidden it from view. What emerged wasn't new. It had been standing the entire time, hidden under decades of neglect. A genuine, 76-year-old, legally recognized hedgerow boundary marker, exactly where his great-great-grandfather had planted it, running along the very edge of the ridge that Kessling was preparing to bulldoze. To the town, waking up to see it fully cleared and exposed for the first time in living memory, it looked like it had appeared overnight, a wall of thorns where none had been visible before. The rumor spread fast, the way rumors do in small towns, and by the time it reached the local paper, it had already become something close to legend. But the legend had teeth because it had law behind it. When Kessling's surveying crew showed up in October, they found not an empty stretch of unclaimed forest, but a fully intact, healthy, maintained hedge, rowed directly on the property line, described in a document filed at the county courthouse. Ezekiel had finally submitted his grandfather's 1911 survey the week before, along with photographs of the very hedge that proved the boundary had been actively maintained, generation after generation. Exactly as county fencing ordinances required for legal recognition. Kessling's lawyers fought it in front of the county board. They argued the hedge was coincidental, that the boy and his grandfather had staged the whole thing. But 3 elderly residents of Miller's Fork stood up at that meeting and testified they remembered playing near the old Attwater hedge as children in the 1930s. The county surveyor confirmed the tree ring counts on the oldest trunks, consistent with plantings from 1911, not 1987. The paper trail, the living trees, and the town's own memory all told the same story. And it wasn't the story Kessling's company had been counting on. Kestrel Vance Holdings withdrew its claim on the ridge in November. Kessling never set foot in Miller's Fork again. What happened after is the part that still gets told at the Miller's Fork Harvest Festival every year. The town, rather than letting the ridge sit in the same legal uncertainty that had nearly cost them the forest in the first place, worked with the Attwater family to have it formally designated a protected community woodland. Corwin, by then 13, was asked to speak at the small dedication ceremony. He didn't say much. He held up one of the wrinkled, dark seeds from his grandfather's cigar box and said, "This is what it looked like before it started." Corwin Attwater grew up, went on to study forestry at Ohio State, and eventually came back to Miller's Fork to manage the very woodland he'd helped save as a boy. He still keeps a cigar box of Osage orange seeds on his own porch, and he still tells anyone who will listen the same thing his grandfather told him. Some things you protect with paper, and some things you protect with roots, and the smartest people learn to use both. If this story reminded you why the old ways of farming and land stewardship still matter today, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Stories like this one about real American farm families deserve to be remembered, and passing them along is exactly what keeps them alive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.